Right. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you again as we wrap up our week on the communication economy. This is the first of 2 weeks that we'll be focusing on communication issues. For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. My name is David Severance. I'm one of the coaches here at Chirag Shah Coaching, and we're delighted to have you with us. Today's topic is about communicating with people who are not direct speakers. So I'm going to pull up the slide deck here in just a minute. I'm going to start by asking you a question. Do you consider yourself a direct speaker or an indirect speaker? So let me pull that up while you ponder that. Okay. Rachel, can you see the slide deck?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. Okay, so today's topic, communicating with people who are not direct speakers. So let's start by asking this simple question. Please put yes or no in the chat box. Do you consider yourself to be a direct communicator? These are the kinds of people who yes means yes, no means no, keep it brief, get to the point, let's get it done and move on. Are you that kind of a communicator or not? Please put yes or no in the chat box.
We have a good mix of yeses and nos.
Okay, got it. That's not a surprise. In almost any grouping of people, you'll get some people who are more direct speakers, more indirect speakers. Linguists have looked at this, sociologists have looked at this, neurobiologists have looked at this, and one of the ways that they try to make sense of how people communicate is by thinking of a continuum. And a continuum would mean a line of different approaches to something, in this case, communication. At one extreme on the continuum would be direct speakers. On the other end of the other extreme would be indirect communicators. And everybody fits somewhere along that continuum. When you get a group of people together, it's very likely that you get someone more towards this end of the spectrum or more towards that end of the spectrum. And this, of course, is what can make communication difficult. The reality is that we all relate to people around us through communicating. And if you think it's important for you to be able to relate to your clients well, what that really comes down to is, can you communicate well with them? And because people have different communication styles, it means you can't communicate in the same way with everybody. If you have kids, you probably have already experienced this, that you may have better results speaking in a certain way to one child, and maybe it's different with another. Or if you're on a team, you may know that certain people like to keep things short and sweet. Other people like to go a little bit deeper, get the bigger picture, that kind of thing. It's really important for us to think about this stuff because the result of how you communicate is the experience that the other person has of you. And we hear from so many people who say, I want my clients to love me. I want them to have a great experience. I want them to feel like this is a really good experience for them. Well, what that really means is you need to think about how you can communicate with them in a way that it creates that powerful experience for them. So some of you self-identify as a direct communicator, others maybe as an indirect communicator. Let's talk about two truths regarding communication in this case. First, communication styles are as varied as fashion styles. You probably know everybody in your life dresses a little bit differently from you. Some more formally, some less, some with bright colors, some with much more muted colors, some with wild, crazy prints, others with very kind of simple solids, something like that. Some with lots of accessories, some without. An infinite number of fashion styles. Well, the fact is there's just as many communication styles as there are fashion styles, which leads to the second point here. There are no right and wrong communication styles, and this is a trap we often fall into. When we have a certain way of communicating, we communicate that way because it makes sense to us to communicate that way. Our logic works that way, and we assume that for everybody else it makes sense. So let me ask a second question. No matter what kind of communicator you are, have you sometimes had either miscommunication or confusion in your communications with people on your team or your clients? Put a yes or no into the chat box.
We got a couple of yeses, mostly yeses. Grace says
Okay.
Not often.
Chances are you have this kind of an experience in your life where either you're confused about what the situation is, or the other person's confused about what the situation is, or there was a miscommunication. You said A, somebody heard B. Right? These things happen all the time in our lives, some with more people, more often with some than others. And it does come down to how we communicate, how we listen, how we speak. The point here is when we have a certain way of speaking, we tend to think that other people's ways of speaking is bad or wrong. For example, a direct communicator might get frustrated with someone who's an indirect communicator because they might not see them as getting directly to the point. Why do they bring in unrelated information that really doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about here? It doesn't make sense, it wastes time. Direct communicators might see indirect communicators as wandering or unfocused or unclear, when maybe they're not. On the other hand, indirect communicators can often see direct communicators as unduly brusque, rude, insensitive, not subtle. Very easy to get judgmental about the people around us, whether it's a team member, family member, significant other, or even a customer. And so we need to have some sense of where we might be on that spectrum. If we're in the middle, chances are we can kind of style switch a little bit either way, and it's not really too difficult for us. But if we're really on one extreme or the other, it takes a little more effort for us to work in a way that's not our common or most familiar or comfortable way of doing things. So let's take a couple of minutes now just to identify a couple of the typical habits that the indirect communicators display, which makes us see them as the indirect communicators. Here's what indirect speakers tend to do. First, indirect speakers don't always speak in complete sentences. If you're in a conversation with someone who's an indirect speaker, it's quite possible that they'll say something like, well, now that I've told you what I want, and then stop right there. And you're supposed to figure out what the rest of the sentence is. Okay, does that mean you're telling me that I'm supposed to go do what you want? Or are you telling me that I'm supposed to give you permission to go do what you want? What are you asking here? That's a very common habit of folks who are indirect communicators. Second, and this is really important, the words do not always equal the message. This is one of the biggest gaps between strong direct communicators and strong indirect communicators. For the strong direct communicators, yes means yes, no means no. I like that because X. I don't like that because Y. It's very clear the message is the words. But for indirect communicators, very often the message and the words are not the same thing. Here's a perfect example. I was hoping the house would have sold by now, or I expected the house would have sold by now. But what's really on the person's mind is, I don't know how I'm going to pay for my kids' college next month. I have a problem here, and I was counting on the sale of this house to make my life comfortable to be able to pay this college, and now I'm going to have to take out a loan. And you may say, well, why would somebody say, I wish I thought the house would sell by now, when they're really thinking, I don't know how to pay for college. But this is the gist of indirect communication. The person's communication exists within the context of their life, as it does for all of us. But indirect communicators feel comfortable not necessarily saying everything directly. There's an assumption that the person on the listening end of their communication will make some kind of an interpretation that is the right one. Now, before we go any further, you might say, well, it doesn't make any sense to communicate like that. It's so inefficient. It's so ineffective. I'll share with you that if you are a direct communicator, guess what? You're in the minority on the planet. Large swaths of the world are indirect communication dominant societies. Asia, Middle East, Latin America, these broad regions are largely indirect communication regions. North America, Western Europe, especially Northwestern Europe, are generally considered by the social scientists to be the most direct communicators. You can say exactly what you mean, exactly what you're thinking. Offense isn't taken. There's not such a kind of a focus on saving face. It's more about getting to the facts and the details. Whereas the other countries, other places, you see a lot more concern for what's happening in our relationship right now based on how we're communicating, not just what's the information we're communicating. And so you may think, well, okay, it's probably just best for everybody to just say what they think and think what they say. That's fine. But what if you end up serving a client who's from another country? And even if you're from those regions like North America or Europe, it doesn't mean that everybody there is a direct communicator, just as you said a few minutes ago in the chat box. Some of you don't see yourselves as direct communicators anyway. So chances are in your life, 30 to 70% of the people around you are indirect communicators. So third point here, body language can be a message. Body language can be anything. Some of the more obvious things are facial expressions, but some of the more not obvious things also include silence. If you make a pitch to somebody and you say, well, what do you think? And they're silent. Or you end the pitch and you say, well, do you have any questions? And they're silent. Does that silence mean they don't have any questions or they don't have any interest? It's a huge difference. And if you make a misassumption about which it is, you can lose. And so we need to understand that in the indirect communicators, which are also called high context communicators, that's what the scientists call them. Generally, the context surrounding the words is every bit as important as the words themselves. And this is why the words themselves are not necessarily the message. That person who said, I wish the house would have sold sooner than now, is making that statement within the larger context of having a child entering college in 2 months and having to pay for that college in 1 month. And finally, tone can be highly nuanced. Do you ever hear anybody go through a house or do something with you and at the end they say, that was interesting? What did they mean by that? That was interesting. That's different from saying that was interesting, right? If somebody reads a book or they see a movie and they say that was interesting, or somebody says that was interesting, what are they getting at there? It's a challenge for the listener to interpret what it is that the speaker is saying. And this is one of the biggest challenges for anyone who lives or works with indirect communicators. So let's talk now about 5 things that you can do to help you work more effectively, which really means relate or communicate more effectively with indirect speakers. You could use any of these and you would help your ability to create a powerful rapport and trust and relationship with your client or your teammates. And if you apply more than one, then you're doing even better. But what I'd like to ask you when we get to the end here is which of these sounds like one that you could employ a little bit more, that you'd like to employ a little bit more? First, work at listening. Second, don't take statements at face value. I'll go through all these in more detail in just a minute. Clarifying to check understanding. This is something we don't always do. Fourth, ask for more information. And fifth, go beyond the words of the conversation itself by exploring their world. Let's talk about each of these for just a minute. First, work at listening. You need to understand that if you're going to work with, whether it's a teammate or whether it's a client or an affiliate, somebody you work together with to serve a client, you need to work at listening carefully if you're with someone who happens to be an indirect communicator. You can't just simply just take the words at face value and just say, okay, that's fine. You can't be driving in the car, looking at your phone and also listening to the client in the back seat about what they're saying, because you will not catch the nuance. You will not catch the body language. You have to sit down, look at the person if you can, if you're in the same room with the individual in the same place, and think very carefully about what you're hearing and how that might make sense within the larger context of the person's life. So you have to know, you have to make an effort here. You can't listen casually and really capture what the person is really communicating. Second, don't take statements at face value. This is one of the biggest points. When the words do not equal the message, what that means essentially is you can't pay attention only to the words. If you simply take the words at face value, you will be hearing the wrong message. And this happens all the time. For example, if a client says, goes through a house, take a client through a house, they say, well, that was interesting. What are they referring to there? Are they saying that that was really an interesting house and it moves up to the top of their list? Or are they saying that some feature that they saw in the house, which they've never seen in another house anywhere in their life, was so wacky and crazy that they can't believe somebody would actually have something like that? Huge difference. And so you can't simply take the statements at face value. You need to explore a little bit further. And if you can get in the habit of trying to think beyond the words and understand what really might be behind it, then you can use a follow-up question. For example, if the person says, well, that was interesting, you can say, what part are you referring to? Or you could say, if you have a hunch that the person is referring to that strange feature that you saw in the family room downstairs, you could say, are you referring to that thing down in the family room or something else, right? You're trying to get a little bit more information so that you can understand what the real kind of message was there. When we take the words at face value, we're sometimes so far off base. And if we're a low context communicator, that's our habit, because we speak in direct sentences. Yes means yes, no means no. Here's what I think, here's why I think it. It's very straightforward and simple. Sometimes we say that people who work with the direct communicators can get by with low antenna. That is, they don't have to listen too closely to what it is the person's saying. Whereas when you're working with someone who's an indirect communicator, you have to put those antenna up very high to be able to decode very sensitively what the real message is here. And so if you happen to be a direct communicator, you need to be very thoughtful about not simply taking the words at face value. Next, clarify to check understanding. It's so important with an indirect speaker to take time sometimes to make sure that your interpretation is the right one. If a person says, that was interesting, you have to say, so are you referring to that thing down there? Or if the person says, that was not my favorite house that we've seen so far, you need to probe a little bit. So are you saying that it's because it was too small? I heard you say as we were walking through it, all the rooms seemed small to you, or is it because the backyard wasn't as big as you were hoping? I heard you mention that. Is that what you're referring to? It's a simple tactic to use, but if you don't apply it, then your misassumption sends you down the wrong track, and you're going to have more trouble finding the right place or helping the person find clarity about what the right match is for them going forwards. Next, ask, what else is there? What else do I need to know? This is really useful. Sometimes you get half the story and you don't know how much of the story is still out there because the person hasn't said it. Especially a person who's not a person who's an indirect speaker, who's also rather introverted, doesn't say a lot. Chances are there's a lot more to the story than you're actually getting. And so get into the habit of asking, what else? What else do I need to know here? What else would you like to share? What else is on your mind? Asking a simple question like that sometimes opens up a whole new piece of information that could be crucial for you going forward. Imagine only getting half the story and then trying to act on that. But that's what we often do with folks who are indirect communicators. We get half the story and then we fill in the blanks for everything else. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're not. And if you're not, it's gonna cost you. So a simple tactic is to just ask, what are you missing? What else is on their mind? What else do they want to share? Last one, finally, this is really important. Explore their world to understand their context. When you're not talking directly about a specific house or a deal or something like that, use your relationship building time to understand more and more and more about what's happening in their world. Because folks who are communicating, even in a direct way, are as attached to their world as the direct communicators are. They just don't have a way of expressing it the same way. And so if you can understand that that person has this kid going to college, and the reason that they need this house to sell fast is really because they need to pay for college, they may not have come out and said it. But if you're asking questions and you're learning about how the world looks from their eyes, then you're going to be able to understand something as fact rather than as an assumption. So let me just ask a question. How many of you spend time trying to understand your client's world after the first week or two? How many of you spend all the time doing your due diligence at the beginning and then kind of just like, don't talk much about it after that? I'm curious. Please put the yes or no in the chat box. How many of you spend time to continue growing your knowledge of their life and their world, even after you've started and kind of started to build a relationship?
A lot of yeses.
A lot of yeses, good. It's really important to continue to do this throughout the relationship because you never know what you don't know. And the thing is, there's what we know, there's what we don't know, and there's what we don't know we don't know. And that's third one. That's the one that can rock your world because you can make assumptions about what you don't know. So for example, you may know that the client has 2 kids, and you may not know what the kids' interests are. But what you don't know, and what you don't know is that they also take care of a cousin frequently because one of the parents died and the other person works. And so there's actually another kid in the picture. And it never occurred to you that that third kid was in the picture. Maybe that kid sleeps over some nights because the single parent, can't get home at the right time or something like that. Maybe they didn't say it to you and it never occurred to you. But sometimes it's that fact that you don't know that really changes the game for you. So it has to be a habit, especially for the indirect communicators in your life, that you continue to probe and understand, not in a manipulative way, not in an inappropriate way, but simply keep growing your knowledge so that you can understand their world as clearly as they understand it. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I have a couple of questions for everybody who had a little time left that wanted to be able to get some feedback from you. So first question, which of these 5 tactics is one that you don't necessarily employ too often and you think you'd like to employ a little bit more with one of your clients? Please put the number of that one into, or put the words of it into the chat box.
David, maybe you could put that slide back up so people know.
Okay, I can do that, sure. There it is. So here are the 5. Work at listening. Don't take statements at face value. Check to clarify understanding. Asking what else is there? What else do I need to know? What else are you thinking about? And finally, this ongoing process of exploring their world to understand what the world looks like from their point of view. So what are we getting in the chat box, Rachel?
We got some 2s, we got a 3. Corey says she's doing all of them.
Got it?
A couple more 2s. Carla says 4.
Yeah. Great. So they're all important, and any one of them practiced well can be a game changer for these clients or these teammates. I can't tell you, you can probably guess how much information gets lost through miscommunication and misassumptions in the world, right? You hear the old thing, assume makes an ass out of you and me, whatever, right? Everybody recognizes that there's a certain loss factor in all of our communication, that we send out 100% communication, but only 90% of it lands, or only 80% of it lands. And so that miscommunication, that confusion, that gap represents money lost. It represents a client less satisfied than he or she might otherwise be. It may represent a referral you get or don't get. I mean, it's real money on the table. And so your opportunity here is to employ any of these in a way that builds an extraordinary relationship. And an extraordinary relationship is always built around person understands me, person cares about me. If that person in the end can't feel extremely good about how well you understand him or her, or how well you care about him or her, you're leaving money on the table. This one about not taking words at face value, I'll give you an example. My wife is from Japan, very indirect communicating country. It's been a challenge for me and an opportunity for me to practice my communication throughout my life with her. There's a supermarket that's right near us. It's about a mile away, and you can go this way or you can go this way. And she likes to go this way because it's a little bit shorter, but there's a stoplight there. And I like to go this way because there's no stoplight, and I hate to wait at stoplights, even though it's a little bit longer. So she always goes this way. I always go this way. It depends on who's driving. And so a couple of months ago, we were at the supermarket. We bought all the food. We put it in the trunk, and we got into the parking lot. And I was driving, and I got to the edge of the parking lot where I had to turn left her way or right my way. And when I got there, she was looking straight ahead, didn't say anything, but was just looking. As soon as I put on the blinker to turn my way, she said in Japanese, I wonder which is the best way to go. Bam, clear message. What was the message? Don't go your way, you idiot. Go my way, right? It was a very clear message, but very, very indirect. And because I know her well, I knew exactly what she was talking about. And this is the point about indirect communicators. The context of the relationship is everything in the relationship. You need to understand what that is so that you can interpret the words. So generally, people who are indirect communicators do much better with other people who know them well. And the indirect communicator countries tend to be countries where people traditionally have stayed home a little bit more and developed longer term relationships with each other. But what you're doing here is you're coming together with a stranger and you're trying to build a relationship over a relatively short term. And when it's a high context person, when it's a indirect communicator, it's very hard for them to have that understanding from your side to be able to interpret their words correctly. but it's absolutely crucial. So let me ask you, when you consider the communication that you have with one of your clients, can you share? I'd like to ask somebody to come off mute and just share with us a brief instance, like I just shared, of a very indirect communication message, so we can think about what did they say and what did they really mean. So who'd like to come off of mute and just share one, please? Nobody? Quiet group this morning?
I'll do
Think
it.
about it. Pardon? Is that
I'll
Heidi?
do it. Yes.
Great, thank you, Heidi. Tell us, what did the person say and what was the real message?
Okay, so I brought this up about the client I have that wants to overlist, their house, overprice it. And it's interesting because the wife called me yesterday and reached out and said, we're going to talk about this. I sent them the CMA and what have you, and to justify the pricing and a couple of other documents that would support, the disadvantages of overpricing. And then she got into, he has a disability, number one, but she got into how they were going for their second COVID vaccine, and she had wrecked her car, and the house is actually owned by a trust. And I said, should we get on the Zoom call with the executor? And she said, Heidi, no, because he wants to take as much control as he possibly can. And he wants as few people involved in it as possible. And it was just kind of a light bulb moment for me right there. And I was glad that she shared that with me, because I would have never known. So there's some struggle there within all of that makes me understand it a bit better.
Thank you for that example, Heidi. That illustrates a sixth point, which is often applied very effectively. And I just forgot to put it on the list, and that is double checking your understanding with a third party. It's very common with folks who work with indirect communicators, when two people heard what it is that the person said, or they were in a meeting together, or they share a situation together, to go to the third person and just say, is this what the person meant when the person said X? I just want to double check my understanding. Or can I just ask you one question about this? It's sometimes a very good tactic. If you're working with a couple and the couple who does most of the speaking seems to be kind of an indirect communicator to you, if you're able, talk to the other one and see if you can get the real lay of the land. And sometimes that second piece of information that you get from the person changes everything, as Heidi just said. Thank you. Let's hear, we have time for one more story. Who else has a brief example to share? Quiet group on a Friday.
Yeah, nobody's volunteering. I know you guys have had some work with indirect communicators.
This is a tough topic, just so you know, everybody. It's tough to identify someone as this kind of a communicator or that kind of a communicator, but you can look at your results. If you're having trouble with miscommunication, if you're having trouble with confusion, it's telling you that there's something going on in that communication interface that's not working. And it won't happen with all your clients. Maybe 30% of your clients are indirect communicators, maybe 50%, maybe more, who knows? But to be able to manage this gap between different styles is one of the most profitable things you can do in your work. And also, if you work with a team, absolutely, to maximize the productivity of the team means to maximize the productivity of the communication and the relationships. Okay, I'm going to give you one last chance to share a brief story. Otherwise, we're going to break. Anybody else? Okay, here's something from Renee.
I do have one.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Allie. Thank you.
So I was working with a buyer, and they got cold feet. They weren't ready to purchase anymore. And their mom actually called me and explained to me that the reason they were getting cold feet was because their dad had passed away like a year ago. And so purchasing this home wasn't just purchasing like their dream home. It was moving on from this tragic event. And that's why she was backing away, which I didn't know. So once I knew that, I understood and could relate to that. Like, my dad had passed away. So now, you know, we spoke, and I'm going to check in with her in a few months just to see how she's doing, but I have like a better understanding. And, you know, it wasn't about the money, it wasn't about the place, it was just about this like very personal thing that had happened to her.
Got it. It's a good example. Thank you, Ali. So the point for this one is we need to make sure that we're not letting messages go over our head. What we hear time and time and time again from the direct communicators is they never told me. And I'm not saying this is what happened in Ali's case, but it brings it up for me. We need to make sure that the message doesn't go over our head. The people who are the indirect communicators will say, I sent a message. This is the problem we have with team leaders all the time. If you're an indirect communicator as a team leader and you're working with some direct communicators on your team, the direct communicators will say, you never told me that, because they were looking for the exact words that say, go do this way. Whereas the indirect communicator boss will say, I want you to create a good report, you know, and they're kind of trusting that the person knows what the good report means, or I want you to manage the CRM, and they understand, they trust that they understand what that means. In this particular case, it could easily have been someone gave a little hint earlier in the relationship. I'm not saying that happened in Ali's case, but just imagine if the person said early in the relationship, well, it's been a challenging 6 months, and so now we'd like to just move forward and buy such and such a house. If you start only focusing on what kind of house they want and you don't somehow circle back to what made that a challenging time, you may miss something that's really crucial. And it could be that someone passed away. It could be that they had a health issue. It could be that they had financial issues. It could be that whatever, who knows? And so to have that little message, which is, it's been a challenging 6 months, but now we want to move forward and start fresh. If you never kind of get back to that, you may be missing something that could turn the whole relationship around. So don't let anything go over your head. That's why we need the high antenna, so that things don't go over our head. Okay, thank you, everybody. It's time to stop for this morning. Glad to have you with us. We're going to do some more communication stuff next week. I'm looking forward to seeing you again on Friday. Go out, practice one of these, and tell us how it works for you. We want to hear some stories about somebody who did one of these 5 things, and it added a boost to the relationship, and it ended up with a referral 6 months later or whatever. Love to hear a story like that. Good luck, everybody out there today. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Just as a reminder, we will not be having session on Monday because it's President's Day. We'll send you an email later revising next week's schedule. Have a good one.